If you're a homeowner in Oregon,
all right, welcome back. Let's get rolling. Happy Friday. I hope that you're doing well. I know that this is the point in the year where things really start to pick up and are pretty busy. I know some of you are traveling or will soon be traveling for athletics or extracurriculars. So best of luck if you're doing that soon. I also know that there's a lot of things going on in your classes, assignments, due dates, and all of that good stuff. The two things to have on your radar for this class is the second Canvas prompt that's due by the end of the day today. Again, you could choose that as one of your 6 if you would like to. And then the syllabus quiz that's also due by the end of the day today. Again, that's open note, open book. I recommend just having the syllabus open and working through that on Canvas as you're working through the quiz. So those things are coming up. So have those on your radar. They shouldn't be too intensive to work on. And we'll be continuing to discuss issues in interpersonal communication and personality for today. So to get us started, I'd like to do another one of those practice questions. You don't need to turn it in, it's not graded, but relates to this idea of interpersonal communication that we hit on last class. So Lucy is meeting her boss, Cindy, for the first time. However, Lucy's worried about how she comes across and is worried that she's seeming awkward or unorganized to her boss, Cindy. Lucy is imagining how she presents herself to Cindy, which would be known as either A, self-concept, B, self-esteem, C, ideal self, or D, looking glass self. I'll give you a couple minutes to refer back to your notes and we'll talk about this one together. Anyone who would like more time on this question? Okay, great. So how many people believe this is A, self-concept, B, self-esteem, C, ideal self, D, looking glass self? All right, so yes, the correct answer is looking glass self. So looking glass self is an idea that we talked about last class. It is imagining how we look to other people. So the example I used last class is if you're about to go on a date and you get like a big stain on your shirt, then you're worried over the course of the date that they have noticed the stain and they're paying attention to it, right? So you're imagining how they might be looking at you and seeing the stain on your shirt. So looking glass self is, again, imagining how you look to other people and what that performance that you're doing is looking like as you're talking with others. So self-esteem, right, is a value judgment that you have about yourself. Am I a good person? Am I a bad person, right? While those elements are somewhat present here in talking about her worried about coming across as awkward and unorganized, the question is mostly focusing on how she's imagining her presentation, right? So that would be the best fit there. Self-concept refers to a stable set of beliefs about yourself. So for instance, I'm a tall person, I'm a short person, that would be self-concept. And an ideal self, right, is how you would like to be. So it's upon looking in the mirror and wishing that it was a queen, right? So that helps us try to break down these parts a little bit. Looking glass self, again, is that imaginary performance piece that's present. All right. So we got into this and a few other ideas last class. Last class, we talked about interpersonal communication, right? Communication with yourself. It's a skill that we do that helps us to make decisions. And we also use it to make evaluations and figure out who we are and if we like the people that we are. Does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about last class or anything about the course more broadly at this point?
What would be a good way to determine between self-esteem and self-worth? Like,
yes, right. So self-esteem is sort of determining how you feel about yourself. So very much, do I like who I am or not, right? It's very much predicated on how you view yourself as good or bad. Self-worth, you could think about as almost like tied to value, like tied to monetary value, right? So, right, humans shouldn't be determined in that way, of course, but self-worth might be to say, I think that I am valuable to society, or I think that I am good at doing, for instance, kind things to other people, right? So it's sharing how you feel like you're able to fulfill a particular value. So that component makes self-worth a bit different. Self-esteem, am I good or bad? Self-value, right, would be more about that judgment. Any other questions? Okay. So for today, we are going to look at interpersonal communication in the context of personality, right? And personality matters for a study of communication because understanding the personality and perspective that we're coming from helps us to understand why we communicate the way that we do, why we see connections the way that we do. And if we think back to Maslow's hierarchy, right? This idea that we're communicating to fulfill needs, well, everybody's needs are different based on our own social needs, what types of relationships we want, how much social contact that we want with other people, and so on, right? So figuring out personality, both what personality means to us and also personality of other people and how personality differences could shape communication in different ways, I think does a good job of helping us understand why it's important. We'll talk about attachment and elements of attachment in that process too, which is an idea that this week's Canvas prompt gets at a little bit. So personality matters to understanding why it is that we communicate the way we do, what it is that we want, and how our relationships with other people develop. So let's take a stab at trying to define and unpack what personality is. If you were asked to describe what personality is, or if somebody asked, what is your personality, right? What are they saying? What is personality?
your demeanor.
Okay, demeanor, how you come across to other people is part of it. How many of you have ever taken a personality test before? Okay, several of you probably did for this week's prompt, right? The Ocean personality test, right? Another popular personality test is the Myers-Briggs personality test, right? Sorts you in a 4x4 grid, assessing things like introversion, extroversion, et cetera. Yeah. So your demeanor is part of it. What are other things that make up your personality? Yeah.
Action you do.
Yeah. Right. So our actions are really a big determinant of personality. Oftentimes, right, we say that somebody talks a big game, or, talks the talk, but can they walk the walk, right? Can they be the things that they say that they are? They say that they're a kind person. Are they doing kind things? So how they speak about themselves as well as their actions tie pretty closely to personality too. So personality, right, building off of this idea of demeanor and elements that make us unique, right, is this combination of traits that help to make who we are, right? My dad was a therapist who famously, in our family at least, hated personality tests. He felt like something like Myers-Briggs or Ocean was reductive in that people are so much more than just like a few attributes, right? Or you don't necessarily define yourself based on those things. Like I'm an INFJ. I'm an INFJ. That's how I behave, and I communicate based on that, right? People are not necessarily easily able to fit in a box, but what personality tests and assessments do is help us to figure out trends and aspects of who we are that we might highlight as something we appreciate and develop our sense of self-concept out of, but also things that we find ourselves wanting to work on or adjust. For instance, finding ourselves a little bit introverted and maybe wanting to break out of our shell, right? So personality tests don't define us, but they can help us to understand ourselves a little bit better if we think that it's accurate. How many people in classes such as psychology, sociology, and other courses have ever heard about twin studies? Seen twin studies being used? So a few of you, right? So twin studies are incredibly useful for social and psychological experiments. And the reason for this is because when you're conducting a scientific experiment, right, you have a control group and you have an experimental group. The control group is the group, of course, where everything stays the same, and you're testing it against the experimental group. So if you're growing plants and you're using a new fertilizer, you're giving the regular old fertilizer or no fertilizer at all to the control group. You're giving this new fertilizer to the experimental group to see if it works, right? So in the case of identical twins, they share genetic markup. They essentially look the same, and they have been passed down the same genes from their parents, right? Fraternal twins, that's not quite the same because the collection of genes that they could get are going to look a little bit different, even though they share between parents, right? But in an identical twin situation, it raises this question of nature versus nurture. How many people have heard nature versus nurture before? Yeah, most of you. Nature refers to this idea that elements of our personality that make us who we are biologically determined, that you are hardwired or coded to act or behave in a certain way. Nurture suggests that instead, what shapes our personality and development of us as human beings is about our surroundings and the experiences that we have, right? Our primary and secondary socialization. Primary being our close friendships and family members that we develop early in life. Secondary being when we started going to school and forming connections with our peers. That idea is that the way that we socialize shapes our personality. Our own choices shape our personality. But if you're over on the nature extreme, you say, well, our genes do that. So I wanted to share a short video of a psychologist who actually explores the nature-nurture discussion in the context of twin studies a little bit more. And I think has some interesting findings about how personality might differ for people that point to this question and how to address this question.
The beauty of identical twin parts is that they share only their genes and not their environment. Any resemblance between them is tied to their common genes. We find some amazing similarities in identical twin parts, many more than we ever would have anticipated. Not just in the more traditional areas of intelligence, personality, physical features like height and weight, but in some more unusual habits, such as a pair of twins who both used to scatter love letters around the house to their wives, and both did their nails down to the nub, and both explained their same mixed headache syndrome exactly the same way as someone is beating on their head with a hammer. These are very challenging, and you can ask yourself, are they due to this random chance? My answer to that is no, they're not. And the rarer they are, the more I believe it's somehow tied to their genes and the way the genes interact with their environment to produce these kinds of unusual similarities. I think the people who find it challenging or even disturbing are those who don't fully understand the process. They think the genes work in deterministic ways, and in fact, they work in probabilistic ways. And so it doesn't mean that we're set in stone, we can't change. It means that we can change. We can alter environments, make behavioral expression different. We can work to prevent disease or to mitigate it, but we can't all be the same.
piano doesn't have to go that hard at the end, but it does. Right, I think that these findings do a good job of helping us understand what twin studies can teach us about personality and how much personality falls in nature and nurture, right? I like this idea that genes and what we get from our genes are not deterministic, right? They don't tell us how we will behave, but instead they help us to understand certain behaviors and traits that we're more or less inclined to. A good example of this would be that maybe based on your personality, you find yourself pretty withdrawn and introverted. But rather than saying I'm introverted, I don't talk to people, right? We have to put on a face, we have to talk to people, we have to engage in social relationships. So we do have agency to the extent that we can modulate how we perform and present ourselves to other people, knowing certain things about our personality, right? This is a little bit different than the idea of temperament. So oftentimes, if you have owned a pet, right, or work with pets, there's a good chance that you've heard about a discussion of the pet's temperament. Back here on the right is a chart that's identifying different dogs and how their breeds are inclined for particular temperaments based on how affectionate or aggressive they might be. And temperament is focused more on genes. Right? We know that certain breeds of dogs are more inclined to engage in aggressive behavior than others, right? And that's this idea that people are predisposed genetically to act or behave or relate in a specific way. So somebody's temperament or predisposition might be to be a bit more of an aggressive person, right? That just might be how they're coded. That doesn't mean that they're going to yell and scream and beat people up, right? It's a question of how people are choosing to act on and behave in the context of their temperament. So they might find cathartic and other ways to get out that type of energy and find ways to positively communicate with others. So temperament does not necessarily mean that somebody will communicate in a certain way. It just means that there are elements that they're working around. So temperament, right, is something that tends to be picked up on from a pretty young age. There are certain signs of people's temperament. Developmental stages show us elements of how young children are communicating and relating to their peers. And these differences in temperament are also present in a variety of animal species too. So personality is more of a social and cultural thing about how we are the way we are and how we relate to other people. Temperament is more biologically focused, but both are important because they shape the way that we might choose to communicate with others. So personality and how we can figure out personality through measurement matters to us because if we figure out how people communicate, we figure out what personalities of people look like, we're better at communicating and relating to different people, right? If you're in a very introverted group, you're not going to ask everybody to just start talking to strangers. You might do some activities to break the ice and help people get more connected to each other, right? So understanding and figuring out personality helps us become better at communicating. So one of the big personality tests that's discussed in your book and I asked you to explore for this week's prompt is the Ocean personality test. And I think this is an interesting one. It was developed by a variety of psychologists and social theorists. And it's a useful way to examine differences in how people communicate with each other, right? This first one is this idea of openness. So there's a book that's pretty famous in a lot of corporate and marketing communities called Who Moved My Cheese, right? And the premise of the book is that you have two humans and two rats who live in a maze, and their goal is to find the cheese in the maze. But over time, it turns out that the location of the cheese in the maze changes, right? The idea is that the two humans and the two mice are different in how they're reacting to that change. So in the case of the mice, they adapt and they try to figure out a new route and try to figure out where the new cheese is. And in the case of the humans, they're more stubborn and unwilling to change. And as a result, keep going back to the same spot and the cheese isn't there. That's an idea of openness, right? To what degree are we willing to adapt to and open up to new information? Are you somebody who will always try something at least once? Or are you comfortable in a routine and things that you're regularly doing? So that's what openness looks at. And openness could affect how willing we are to disclose and share with other people, and our willingness to understand and embrace new ideas that are communicated to us. Conscientiousness goes back to Atticus Finch, right, that we talked about last week about listening and developing good listening skills. Conscientiousness is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around with them for a while. This idea that we are aware of our interactions and how we are impacting other people, right? We're checking in with other people and seeing how they're doing. So a conscientious person is talking with a friend and they notice that their friend seems really distant. They seem a little bit upset. Their nonverbal communication is a little bit off, and we check in with them and see how they're doing. So our ability to understand and be aware of that would be conscientiousness. Extroversion, right? So there's not an inherently good or bad thing about being more introverted or extroverted. It's a question of culture and how cultural organization might shape how outgoing we are, right? For instance, in a lot more collectivist cultures, there tends to be a greater emphasis on being a bit more introverted and reserved. In fact, being loud and independent is oftentimes seen a bit more negatively. Whereas in the United States, we tend to value extroversion a lot, right? Yes.
You think like with COVID and isolation and all that happened with people, do you think extroversion is going to become a lot more prevalent now because of the isolation people like experience and that they just want to get out more?
That's a great question. I think so. I think that a lot of people through COVID have come to realize that they are not as introverted as they thought they were, right? A lot of people who felt the deprivation of social relationships and really enjoyed the face-to-face contact with other people might have those longer-term effects where they're interested in people and spending time with people a bit more, right? So I think there's a difference between what we tell about ourselves, how introverted we are, versus what we actually might need or feel more fulfilled with. I think a lot of people might realize what it is that they're looking for in relationships in the way that they did.
So do you think like an older generation, like let's say our age, are going to be more extroverted? Do you think the younger generation, which haven't really experienced all that social things before COVID, do you think they're going to be more introverted because of it? Because they just don't know how to, be a little more social and communicative, I guess. Like, what's your opinion on that, I guess?
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. One thing that I would say that is really interesting is that the ways people are communicating is really different. I think that like looking at the younger generation and looking at social media, that a lot of people are using social media for human connection in a way that's very different, right? Especially through things like TikTok and a lot more of the newer outlets. There are ways of forming connections that are not necessarily face-to-face, but that can be really meaningful and important. So I think that the way we might define introversion and extroversion, like face-to-face versus online, is going to get more challenging. I think there's a lot of people who are comfortable being more extroverted online and less so face-to-face. Yeah, so really good questions, right? Getting at some of the ways that these things change and the challenge of measuring those things in our environment. There's also this idea of agreeableness. So agreeableness, right? It's said that people who can debate and disagree, but still be respectful to each other, right, can disagree without being disagreeable. Agreeableness is this idea that we do things that are supportive of other people, right? That we are seen as kind or nice or supportive of other people. A good example of this is this idea of altruism, of donating or supporting or doing something that's kind to other people without expecting something in return. I was reading, there's like the ultimate sort of question of whether or not you might fit under being an agreeable person is whether or not when you go to the grocery store, you put your shopping cart back or put it in the cart return thing, right? Because there's nothing that's going to happen to you if you don't, right? There's nothing you lose. It's just a question of doing something for other people like the workers at the grocery store, right? So agreeableness would be people who put the shopping carts back. So the last one is this idea of neuroticism. And this is one that I think connects pretty closely to mental health, to mental illness, and similar issues, where people who consider themselves maybe more vulnerable to emotional distress, people who feel higher highs and lower lows in their interactions, who deal with greater challenges in their communication, might be considered more extreme on the neuroticism scale, right? So oftentimes, people who rank higher there are people who are a bit more anxious in their relationships and how they're presenting themselves to other people. Yeah, pretty closely connected to mental health and well-being. So again, OCEAN is not the end-all be-all measurement, but it is a way of connecting how personality might relate to our communication. So there are a variety of dispositions and orientations, and I know that those can be a little bit easy to mix up. So if you think back last week when we talked about uncertainty reduction theory, we talked about this idea of reducing cognitive uncertainty. When you think of cognitive, here's a really easy way to remember it. Think about cogs and think about like cogs in your brain, right? The cogs are spinning. It's like what you're processing and what your brain is developing. So cognitive, right, is a question of how it is that we think about the world. I wear a pair of glasses, and I wear a pair of glasses that have the blue light filter. So it's supposed to reduce eye strain when you're working at your computer, right? So what that means is that when I'm looking with these glasses on, the color blue isn't showing up as vividly or strongly. If you wear a pair of sunglasses, right, you're wearing those in a way that kind of distorts your vision. You don't typically wear sunglasses inside because it's a lot harder to see and the colors look all weird, right? In this way, a cognitive disposition is like the glasses that you have, right? It's the thing that you're using to filter and shape the way that you look at the world. So cognitive disposition then impacts how you engage in intrapersonal communication, how you understand yourself, but also relates to how you make sense of and communicate about yourself or with other people. So one of them is this idea of a locus of control, right? So I'll give you an example. Say there is somebody who you're about to meet on a date and they don't show up until like 15 minutes after when they were supposed to see you. And they were like, oh, I'm so sorry. There was nothing I could do. I was trying to make it over, but my car broke down and I wasn't able to get a replacement. And so I had to run down and, oh, everything's the worst. I just don't know what's happening, right? An internal locus of control would be to say, I'm sorry, my car broke down. I am in the process of going to the shop and I will work on being on time in the future, right? And an internal locus of control, it's a person who feels that they have agency and control over their life experiences. In other words, you have power and ability to control your life, right? To adjust your life in a way that might feel a little bit easier for you. An external locus of control essentially says that you do not have that same control, that the world is kind of chaos and you just find yourself thrown into situations without really having a whole lot of agency in that process, right? If you've ever seen The Big Lebowski, right, the dude's character is essentially external locus of control. He's just thrown into situations in chaos, right? Some of you in your first couple weeks of college might be feeling external locus of control. All these things are happening. I don't have a whole level of control or grip over them. But locus of control is also cultural, right? That a lot more individualistic cultures tend to have more language that's focused on individual decision-making, right? Language like pull yourself up by your bootstraps is used in more individualistic cultures, but external locus of control is seen in more collectivist cultures, that the free will or agency of a single person is less of a factor or not seen quite as high. So locus of control is one element. My partner and I are total nerds and we like to debate about the existence of free will, right? So that'd be an example of discussing a locus of control. Cognitive complexity, right? So this is an important idea to know too. One way of thinking about this is the idea that human beings naturally like patterns. We like things to be predictable. We like to be able to mentally sort things. One of the consequences, of course, is that we can be prone to stereotypes. So cognitive complexity is the idea that we're able to mentally sort and map out different things in a way that helps us to make sense of the fact that one interaction and one person is not the same as another person. One really good example about this is in the context of disability, right? When autism or other disabilities are discussed or talked about, the common phrase is, if you've met one person, right? You've met one person. You haven't met everybody. You can't do a full summary of that disability experience because it's different for everybody. Cognitive complexity is the ability to recognize the differences between those events and encounters. So authoritarianism and dogmatism. If you have followed politics and current events over the last few years, I think those words have been used a lot. Whether or not you see them fitting or matching certain issues is up to you, right? But authoritarianism is a term that we see a lot to discuss the idea of people who submit to power, oftentimes without question, right? Authoritarianism has the perspective that ceding or giving over power to a larger group or authority, that is a good thing to do because that authority will have your best interests at heart. Dogmatism refers to a belief in something that might be false, right? And contradicts new evidence. But despite that, right, and despite holding on to a belief that is likely incorrect, you're unwilling to take in new information or change your view. Again, pretty relevant for the last few years. So for instance, right, studies have found that people who are exposed to information that contradicts a deep-seated and sincerely held view on a topic are not actually more likely to be convinced because they've seen the evidence that goes against their perspective. They're actually more likely to dig in their heels and further justify and cement their own perspective on the issue. One of the issues we see in a lot of political debate and discussion is a challenge in having different viewpoints being talked about if people don't agree on facts and don't agree on information and evidence and what is considered to be factual, factually accurate, et cetera, right? So authoritarianism and dogmatism are very much fixtures that impact how we communicate and how we think about the world. And lastly, there's this idea of emotional intelligence. I think emotional intelligence is talked about a lot as a buzzword, right, on social media, like be better at emotional intelligence or improve your emotional intelligence, or somebody's dating profile says, I'm attracted to emotional intelligence, right? That language gets used a lot, but I don't know that emotional intelligence is broken down in a way that helps it to make sense, right? Emotional intelligence means that you understand your own emotions and those of other people, and that you have a vocabulary for processing those experiences. So I think the model on the right helps us to make sense of and break down those different parts. So one of them is perceiving. So if we think back last week, we talked about the perception process, right? Attending, organizing, and interpreting. Can we perceive different emotions across cultures and people? Again, a lot of children with developmental disabilities have greater difficulty with understanding and processing emotions from nonverbal expressions. Like a happy face, right, is a smile facing upwards, a sad face is downwards, etc. Right? We use those cues to perceive and make sense of the emotions that other people are making so that we can understand, again, that really big part of communication and processing. Understanding, right? We have the perception of emotions and we can make sense of those. We know that somebody is sad because we know that they recently lost a relative, right? That would be an example of realizing where those emotions are coming from. Managing emotions, again, that ties back to the idea of personality, that maybe somebody has a more aggressive or angry personality, but they aren't going to blow their top at a gas station attendant, right? They are going to control and dial it in and be in control of those. I'm a big fan of Star Trek. The character Spock on Star Trek, right, is half Vulcan, an alien race that controls or suppresses their emotions. The idea being that if you manage and control them, that you will focus on logic and have a better life. But emotions are part of the human experience, right? feeling a range of emotions and knowing what to do about those is seen as a good thing. And again, our ability to use and integrate emotions into our lives. If somebody is really excited because they just got a scholarship that they applied for, we're going to be happy for them, right? We're going to smile, we're going to share our emotional response. So using emotions effectively, I think, is another important point in emotional intelligence. Again, emotional intelligence is talked about a lot, but I don't know that it's broken down or understood as much as it should be. How many people know who this is on the right? Seen him before? A couple of you. So this is Machiavelli. He is a famous political theorist. If you have ever heard the term Machiavellian used to describe someone or something, that generally means somebody who sees people as pawns or as objects to be used and manipulated to serve their ends. In fact, there are a lot of TV shows and films that have featured characters who would probably be seen as Machiavellian. If you have ever seen shows like House of Cards, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, Mad Men, right? These kinds of antagonistic characters who generally are focused on manipulating other people would fit under the Machiavellian style, right? Machiavelli wrote an article called The Prince, in which he was breaking down essentially how leaders could be effectively using power and essentially manipulating the public to serve their ends. It should be noted that that wasn't his actual perspective, right? So it's a bit of a misnomer to say somebody is Machiavellian because that wasn't actually what Machiavelli believed. It's just what he wrote for royals to use. In any case, Machiavellianism is a socio-personal disposition, a way that we think about mentally who we are and how we should relate to other people. That we should use people to get what we want or manipulate people. Other ways that we experience dispositions, right, would be loneliness. Again, getting to that point about COVID and the ways in which people have experienced loneliness over the last couple of years. Depression, of course, is a longer-term experience and condition that involves a lot of factors that contribute to somebody feeling down. Self-esteem, right, refers to the idea of how people view themselves. We talked about this as seeing yourself as a good or a bad person. Narcissism, right? So narcissism comes from the story of Narcissus. Narcissus, as the story goes, was able to look at his own reflection in the mirror, and he was so in love with himself and so into his own image that he died and became a flower, right? A narcissus flower, because he just looked at himself, right? So narcissism is being stuck in your own world, is having a preoccupation with yourself. And there's a good chance that you probably know a narcissist in your life. Then we have attachment styles, right? So this is one of the ones that's brought up in your prompt for this week. What we have here is a 2x2 quadrant. And this quadrant is basically measuring how you feel about yourself. So if it's positive, that means you like yourself and you have good self-esteem. You value who you are, right? If it's low, you don't feel very good about yourself. You don't think that you're a very worthy of love person. And then the other approach is how you view other people. Are you interested and view people highly? Do you want to create connections with other people? Or are you somebody that is a bit more stranger danger oriented and fearful of other people? A secure attachment style, right, is one that's not like this, it's like this. Right? It's the idea that you and another person are comfortable, you're intimate, you feel valued in a relationship, and you value the other person. So that's an approach that tends to create very good, developed, and emotionally intensive communication. Preoccupied means that you are interested in connecting with other people, right? You value other people highly, but you're a little bit anxious about yourself, right? So you don't value yourself in the same way. So you might be a person that does a lot of check-ins about the relationship. Do you still like talking to me? Do you still want to be friends, right? Because you don't value yourself in the same way that you value the other person. So oftentimes you see people looking for check-ins and extra support if they're a preoccupied style. In a dismissing style, that would mean that you value yourself, but you don't necessarily value forming relationships with other people. So if you're the type of person who, like a roommate or friend is inviting you to a party, you say, I don't really want to go, right? You're not interested in meeting new people or forming new connections, right? You would consider yourself more in the dismissing style, right? He, she, they is not that into you, right? Is the language used to describe dismissing as an attachment style. And then a fearful style is one in which you do not view yourself very highly, but you also don't view other people highly or trustworthy either, right? So you're anxious and pretty on edge and pretty reluctant to form connections. These 4 attachment styles are generally considered to be pretty stable. That is, people generally fit into one of 4 in their relationships, but there might be variations depending on culture and context. For example, if you're visiting a country that doesn't speak the same language you do, and you're normally a more secure attacher, you might be a little bit more preoccupied, right? Because you're trying to learn the language and the culture. So these 4 styles might be present in romantic relationships and friendships and family relationships. They are how we choose to connect with other people. And then lastly, we have communication dispositions, which run on a bit of a spectrum. And I'm going to have us look at these a little bit more. So I'm going to have you all into 4 different groups. I want each group to look at one of these 4 dispositions. The disposition discussion starts on page 101. And I want you, one person can write or type per group. What is that disposition? And then how might 2 people who are on either extreme of that disposition communicate? So one person who's very far on the approach side, one person who's very far on the avoidance side. So take some time to discuss those, and then we'll talk about that together. Yeah.
Page 101 of what?
Of the textbook PDF. So there's the Wrench ebook. So if there's somebody in your group that has access to that, you can pull it up and connect to there, or you can discuss that amongst members of the group.
Okay.
So we'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4 on introversion and extroversion. We'll do 1, 2, and 3 on approach and avoidance. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4 on argumentativeness and verbal aggressiveness. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on socio-communicative orientation. So if you don't have a device with you, I'd encourage you to have one person in your group who just pulls up the definition of that and using that as a starting point for your discussion.
Yellow.
Person, it kind of sounds like they're just anything.
More likely to initiate the conversation.
How much people would be really
From
proud of
this
this?
time. What they have.
Like, well, oh, it was. Verbal aggression.
Why? On either side of the extreme. Somebody was in her they just.
They should probably also
Okay, so it sounds like there are some good observations here. I'd like to see what you all were able to come up with at this point. So let's start with introversion and extroversion. What were some things that you all noticed in this disposition and how people might communicate?
So an extrovert would be more likely to kind of be energized by talking to people, where an introvert would be somebody kind of gets drained by it.
Yeah. So the classic example is that the introvert recharges alone, the extrovert recharges with other people, right? So your willingness to initiate conversation and communication would look different between those two. About approach and avoidance.
Approach and avoidance, situations involving a single goal or option, undesirable aspects or aspects or consequences. So like, they'll approach what they want to do and they'll avoid what they want.
Yeah. So approach and avoidance, right, is about your desire to initiate conversation and contact with other people. Again, looking at the difference between how you're modeling other people in a more fearful or avoidant way versus a more secure or preoccupied. About argumentativeness and verbal aggression.
There's like two people that are fighting or like arguing, and they tend to find or try to find something to like argue about. They usually for like verbal aggressive, they tend to yell like another person, and then like the opposite side of that would be just like somebody like taking it and so not saying much.
Yeah, so argumentativeness, right, is the idea of somebody who's really engaged in debating and discussing the issues. Verbal aggressiveness would be more about attacking the self-concept or that person, right? So an ad hominem attack is when you attack the person rather than the argument. So for instance, saying, I disagree with you on this versus I think you're stupid, right? So argumentativeness might be assertive, it might be disagreeing on the facts, but still being civil, while verbal aggressiveness would be something like bullying or making fun of other people. So I think that distinction between those two is something good to take away. And then socio-communicative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So socio-communicative orientation goes back to a lot of studies who have looked at gender differences in communication. And the actual difference in gender is less important than personality and other elements, right? But how attentive somebody is, if they're more of a talker or listener, how you find yourself oriented in a conversation and how you participate within that conversation would fit under that one. So good responses here. And again, these dispositions help us to understand how we communicate when we're working together. So to wrap up for today, we talked about personality, we talked about dispositions in communication, and we talked about some of those elements of attachment and connection with other people. Next week, we are going to focus on verbal communication, what makes for good and effective verbal communication. So please pass forward or email your group's work for today with your names on it. Make sure to turn in that prompt and quiz today if you haven't already. Have a great rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again in Monday's class. Thank you.